Thank you, Dr. Paris. Can you hear me? Can I leave this here? Good afternoon, everybody. At the outset, I'd like to thank Dr. Fu Zhenlong, the President of the Taiwan National Security Institute, and also recognize Minister Morimoto and his colleagues from Japan, and Mr. Yates, Mr. Steve Yates. As most of you are aware, not only is he a friend of Taiwan, but he's soon to be the senator from Idaho. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for me personally, as some of you are aware, it's always a great privilege and I feel very happy to come back to Taipei. I had occasion to be here and make my first visit under the able, I would say, stewardship of Dr. Paris when I was in the IDSA. And each time, as I said, I learn more about what is happening here in Taiwan, what is happening in the region, and a very, I think, valuable perspective that one does not often get in other parts of the world. So I'm delighted to be back and share my thoughts, and let me continue with, I think, this very rich discussion we've had in the morning in the first two panels. My brief was to speak about the rise of China and the new situation, and deliberately, if you see the way in which we phrase the English title, the new situation in the Indian Ocean and the new situation that will be engendered by the rise of China, which is off the Indian Ocean. So I deliberately chose both. And my synopsis is there. I may make a slight departure. I'll request Dr. Paris to perhaps fill in those blanks. Because as I was speaking this morning to our American colleague, our Japanese minister, and a few of you, it just struck me that I made my first visit to Japan in 1991. I was telling the minister that. And at that time, we were discussing some of the geopolitical possibilities. And one thing which at that consultation between Japan and India, it was very new for Japan, we were discussing a China 2 or 3 years after Tiananmen, 2 years, 89. And as you know, in India we have our own perception and assessment about Beijing. And in terms of the significant possibilities in the maritime domain, I distinctly remember, we were wondering as to whether and when China would be able to enter the Indian Ocean. At that time, it was considered to be a tectonic maritime development for a variety of geopolitical reasons that all of you are aware. So my first proposition is that now, it's almost 22 years since that discussion, and I have periodically had occasion to speak to our Japanese colleagues on this subject, depending on the politics of Japan and how they look at other parts of Asia. I have come here to Taiwan, Taipei in the past, and some of your colleagues have visited us, and we have discussed the same subject, the Indian Ocean and China. And my first proposition is that one of the most significant maritime developments that has taken place in recent years is the presence of the Chinese Navy, the PLA Navy, in the Indian Ocean, ostensibly for anti-piracy. All of you are familiar with the piracy story. It peaks in 2007. 2008 onwards, you find most navies that have the capacity have sent their warships. And for the PLA Navy, for China, I have argued in other places that this was a very, very valuable opportunity which they have frankly seized with considerable, I would say, determination. And from then to now, as a sailor, as most of you are aware, I'm a retired naval person, one of the most significant geopolitical and naval developments is the presence of the Chinese Navy today in the Indian Ocean. That is an empirical fact. They've been there, they now have access to a few ports. littoral of the Indian Ocean, and they have maintained a presence. Now, if you try to contextualize this event, this development, I make the following case that for any major power, there are only three navigable oceans in the world: the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian. And if you trace maritime history over the last 500 years, from the time Portugal and Spain started what you might call as the colonial period, great powers have had a compulsion to maintain a presence, quote unquote, in two of the three navigable oceans. I mean, that is a tenet of maritime and naval strategy, if you will. So I make the submission that if you look at China and its geography, actually China is in a maritime bind. Whatever other people may say outside, I'll say as a sailor, and I'll be happy to be corrected, that if you look at the geography of China and the Western Pacific, China is under enormous maritime / naval constraints. I mean, if you just imagine the geography, I don't have the map here, but China is boxed where it is because of the geopolitics, the American presence, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and as you go down. And if you look at the individual naval capacities of these countries, starting with the US, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and I'm not talking about ASEAN just now, the Chinese Navy would find it very difficult actually. It's not an enabling geography or not an enabling geopolitics. So what does China do? Now, of late, repeatedly, whenever you go to any presentation on China and maritime, naval, Indian Ocean, the opening slide is the Malacca dilemma. It is ascribed to then President Hu Jintao, 2003, and the suggestion that China has a very deep anxiety about the Malacca dependence. As again all of you are aware, in 1993 China became an importer of oil, having been a net exporter of oil from 1949, independent PRC to 1993, and progressively the dependence on hydrocarbons at sea increases. But, and I don't have, as I said, there's no time to get into this in the paper, but I make the case that actually China does have a maritime / naval cognizance, an awareness. And I go back to March 1949, that very famous speech by Mao Zedong, when he talks about the need for China to invest in its air force and its navy. The army is already there, the PLA. And therefore, even today, March 23rd, if you remember, is the Founders' Day of the PLA. That was the day when the speech was made. And I have, in the past, tracked some of these political articulations going back to Chairman Mao's time. And you would find references to the need for China to reclaim a certain naval maritime profile. They talk about the Chinese admirals of the 14th and 15th century, the Yonakan, Zhang He, and so on and so forth. But there is a historical recall. There is this narrative of the Chinese maritime capability. And my formulation is that because the Pacific presents the kind of constraints that it does, there is a certain compelling logic as to why China will look at the Indian Ocean, because it has no locus as far as the Atlantic is concerned. And if you look at the way in which China has moved, frankly, I would say from 1993 onwards, apart from the politics, meaning that there is a very clear political articulation, there is a gradual professional movement. And again, I make the case that this is more discernible after Tiananmen and particularly post-Cold War. And I would say that at the higher political level, it is the Deng Xiaoping era when China becomes more aware and acquires discrete capability. So what has this done in terms of the ocean? When I say that China's presence has led to what you might call as a new situation in the Indian Ocean. The new situation in the Indian Ocean starting from 2008 is that till recently, meaning prior to the arrival of the Chinese Navy, it was an ocean that had a certain status quo, which is that The United States, as the most capable navy in the world, had a presence that stretches really from ASEAN all the way up to the east coast of Africa. It has certain presence as far as the Persian Gulf is concerned. And it has operational units, aircraft carrier groups, etc., that are differently moving using Deja Garcia as the equivalent of a permanent aircraft carrier. The Indian Navy, India, is the most credible navy in that part of the ocean. Geography enables India. And there was what I would describe as a status quo. I make the submission that with the entry of China and the PLA Navy, there is first of all what you might call as a change in the operational grid, in the operational profile. Chinese surface units are there, and over the last year to 18 months, I know that we in the Indian Navy have picked up enough signals to say that Chinese underwater platforms, meaning submarines, have also entered the Indian Ocean. I am sure that every major navy must be monitoring it in its own way. So the first, as I said, inference that you can draw from what I have outlined is that the operational and strategic texture of the Indian Ocean has changed. Now, which leads us to the second part of my argument or my formulation. What does this do? What are the implications? Okay, China is there, so are the Americans, so are the Indians, and if you recall, France as a European Union power has a presence also in the Union. And so there are other navies. And this is perhaps indicative of the fact that the Indian Ocean is now becoming strategically more relevant than it was in the past. And here again I want to make a broad maritime point, if I may, which I am sure the scholars who follow maritime and naval issues will recognize, like my discussants here, that in 500 years, global maritime focus has shifted from ocean to ocean, meaning that in the first part, 16th, 17th century, the colonial experience was driven by European powers, Iberia first, and then it goes to Britain. And the contestation is in the Atlantic and in the Indian Ocean. I mean, there is a whole rich history to be studied about France and England at sea. That if France had won one critical battle in the Indian Ocean, maybe the history of colonialism may have been different, but that's another point. So you find that the global focus shifts from Atlantic, Indian, and progressively by the time the baton passes from Britain to the United States, you see the emergence of the Pacific, and throughout the 20th century, you might say that the global focus is on the Atlantic-Pacific combined, particularly in the Cold War, when again, the sailors here, the maritime experts will recognize there was a certain salience to what used to be called in the submarine arm as the GIUK, Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, and what that meant in terms of naval strategy. This was in the Cold War. The Indian Ocean was a relatively dormant ocean. It was, you might say, relatively unnoticed, neglected. It acquires greater strategic salience, I would say, briefly, when the Shah of Iran is overthrown and the United States redraws, its own priorities, etc. But there is no challenger at that time. So the status quo comes back because the former Soviet Union did not have interest in that part of the world till Afghanistan. But the naval maritime component is not of great relevance. It is after 9/11, that's the case I make, that the Indian Ocean gradually acquires greater strategic relevance. And you see after the end of the Cold War, from Atlantic Pacific, for some time it becomes only Pacific. If you remember the early years after the end of the Cold War, Clinton won. It seemed as if the whole world was focused only on Asia Pacific. And the focus was Pacific maritime policy. After 9/11, it gradually becomes Pacific Indian Ocean. And now, in this year as we speak, from 2012 to 2014, because of the US presence in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other possibilities in Syria, one could make a case that very briefly, we are looking at Indian India. That all the major powers, for a variety of reasons, have their stakes in the Indian Ocean. And China is one of them. And what this does, and this is the second part of my argument, I am saying that China's interest in the Indian Ocean is more than 20 years old. Because to me, post Tiananmen, from the time China becomes a net importer of oil, Malacca dilemma, what does China do? I think, and this is my reading, that China has made a very prudent and a very astute plan, which is that they have invested politically, economically, in certain key countries of the Indian Ocean littoral. The first is Pakistan. Again, that's an old history, so I don't want to go too much into that, except to say that it's a very relevant point. China and Pakistan have a cooperation in weapons of mass destruction, that is nuclear weapons and missiles. And Pakistan has a very curious kind of, shall we say, status, whereby it's a strategic ally of China. It is also a strategic partner of the United States. And this goes back to the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, for various reasons. But for China, now the access to Gwadar, if those of you who remember the geography, Gwadar is a port west of Karachi. It literally straddles the Persian Gulf. And from there, if you come down, China has made investment in Pakistan. China has made an investment in Sri Lanka. The name of the port is Hambantota. China has an investment in Bangladesh. The name of the port there is Chittagong. China has an investment in Myanmar. And like this, there is today what you might call as a very clear plan. And I'm not using the phrase string of pearls because that is not in the Chinese lexicon, it is not in the Indian lexicon. It has been used by some analysts and it just stays. But to me, the implication is that China has a game plan. And in an earlier paper that I did in 1993 or 94, I tried to suggest that China is looking at the Indian Ocean in a very focused way for strategic reasons. And that energy is only one of them. Today, piracy has given them the opening to be there tactically. But I have made one small reference in my synopsis, it is there up on the slide. I have said this paper argues that the really game-changing initiative by China would be if it can change its political geography a la Wegener so as to acquire an abiding presence in the Indian Ocean. Let me elaborate on this. I don't know how many of you are aware of this German maritime strategist. His name is Wegener. He is a German admiral of World War II fame. Most people who study naval and maritime issues are familiar with Mahan, the great American naval strategist. They may be familiar with Corbett. And there is a whole Mahan thesis. There is a Corbett's nuanced understanding of naval power about why you have to have the naval or the maritime element influencing events on land. I mean, that is the core of the Corbett argument. But the forgotten strategist I often feel is Wegener. And I don't want to go into the detail of Wegener in the interest of time, except to make one statement. To me, what is the core of Wegener in today's discussion? Wegener makes a point and he says this to Germany. It's unfortunate, from the German point of view, it's unfortunate that Hitler does not pay attention to him. Otherwise, the war at sea would have been different. Wegener's point is that if you are constrained by geography, you should use politics to trump geography. Meaning that different countries have different geographical advantages or constraints in the maritime domain. I make the case that China is constrained in the Pacific because of geography and geopolitics. If you use the Wegener formulation, how can China access the Indian Ocean? The only way, short of saying that you will create a roadway link from one part of China towards Kunming and then come into the Bay of Bengal, which is not possible. It is to use politics. So, if you can make investments in the littoral, as I said, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Myanmar is one example. The other is to do what the Americans did. The Americans acquired Villa Garcia, the island. It's a small speck in the Indian Ocean from the British. And the original inhabitants are still going to the UN for redress. That's a different matter. But the Americans are there in that case. It has changed their profile in the Indian Ocean. America is a resident power. France is a resident power because of reunion. I am saying that if China follows the same logic, and today you look at China's investment in the Indian Ocean islands. In Maldives, those of you who are familiar with developments in South Asia, we have the SAARC countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and South Asian countries. The last summit of SAARC was held in Malé, in Maldives. And the day of the summit, the day before the summit, China opened its embassy in Maldives. I mean, if you can think of political signaling, there could be nothing more, shall we say, emphatic. So I am making, as an analyst, I am making the case that China is making what you might call as an investment that could be interpreted in the Wagnerian mode. That if you are able to get political support, say from the Maldives or from Seychelles or any of the other islands, there is a whole, by the way, China has a Pacific Island strategy, but I'm not getting into that just now, I'm just sticking to the Indian Ocean. I make the case in my paper that this would be the real game changer. And it is in this context I have said that islands like the Maldives acquire critical significance, not only for China and for India, but for all of us. Every country that is represented in this room today. And what China does with its capacity, that to me is the real concern. I made reference to why is India concerned about China. I think in Dr. Balu's paper, the last phrase is the strategic mistrust between India and China. To me, that is the abiding feature of the Sino-Indian relationship. We may have trade, our trade is now $100 billion, but so do China and Japan. They have even greater trade. So do China and United States. So do China and Taiwan. So robust trade is no indicator of what happens in the strategic and the security domain. So this strategic mistrust, the reason is, what does China do with its capacity? Since I don't have time, I won't go into the details, but I'll just make this again proposition, maybe we can discuss it later. China cannot be trusted from my Indian perspective, one Indian's perspective, because it does not take its power with responsibility and integrity. There is a certain duplicity about China and its use of its capability, where there is a public rhetorical statement and the actions are contrary. Now this links up with what I would call as weapons of mass destruction, and what we in India feel is a very deep anxiety that China is actually using its nuclear weapons through Pakistan to support terrorism. We were recipients in Mumbai in 2008. Today the United States is at the receiving end. And I think one of the greatest ironies is that the United States has given Pakistan some $26 billion maybe aid. And the same money is being used to attack US troops. I mean, there can't be a greater irony, but that is something the US and Pakistan have to deal with. For us, the concern is that when you get this power, what do you do with it? When you get this naval maritime presence in the ocean, what do you do with it? I make the case that China is adopting or following what you might call as a very subtle revisionist agenda. Again, I won't go into the details for the constraints of time. If I have one more minute, if I can just take another minute, I'll try to finish and then ask you whether it was. What does this all mean? I have made this case that both the South China Sea, and that's there in my synopsis, and the Indian Ocean islands, from the Chinese perspective, are representative of constraining and expanding the maritime geography of the Pacific and the Indian Oceans from a very well thought out Chinese perspective. Major powers, and they're all here, United States, Japan, Taiwan, India, should be cognizant of the long-term implications of this development. And this to me is quote unquote the new situation that is gradually crystallizing in the Indian Ocean. And the last point is, okay, if this is the nature of the domain, as I see it, one man's view, what should we do? And we know, sitting here in Taipei, that there are some political, shall we say, constraints again as far as Taiwan is concerned. In similar fashion, there is a limit to what US Taiwan can do. There is a limit to what Japan Taiwan can do. There is a limit to what India Taiwan can do. But I have argued this in the past, and I'm making this case again, and I was talking to Paris about this in the lunch break, that there are some areas where Taiwan can cooperate, which is not necessarily against the current conventional thinking about what is it that Taiwan can do and cannot do. Now, I remember reading about the WHO and Taiwan's own status there as an independent actor and its contribution. I am saying that in the maritime domain, while any form of naval exercise may lead to a lot of, shall we say, political problems that countries may not be able to face or deal with just now. There is a whole, I would say, space under the umbrella of science and technology and oceanography and humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, which I am saying, I've said this in Japan almost 20 years ago, but as I said, Japanese politics at that time was not quite receptive or conducive. But I am proposing again for the consideration of this audience that some selective bilaterals, Taiwan-Japan, US-Taiwan, US-Taiwan-Japan, on oceanography, on SLP, including pollution, oceanic health of the ocean. And this could then be brought into the Indian Ocean because it has a very clear linkage with human security. So I thought I would just leave that as a thought and see whether some of this could be pursued. On that note, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll just briefly,这 Commodore 这个准将哈，他讲到说，印度的新的情势，印度洋新的情势，最主要就是2008年，中国以这个打击这个海盗为名，中国的海军就进入印度洋，进到这个非洲，非洲沿岸那边有这些海盗，那么他就用这样的名义，那么就进入了这个印度洋。现在这个不只是这些对付这个海盗的这个中国海军，甚至于中国的潜水艇也到印度洋来，不只是说这个军事力量之外，他现在在印度洋里边想办法要取得一些岛屿做它的基地。美国这个利欧加西亚本来是英国的这个一块岛，现在变成美国很重要的一个海军基地。现在中国呢，这个像这个用的马蒂夫这个阿尔蒂夫一块岛小国家，用各种经济政治的力量，希望能够借助这个地区把它变成中国的基地。这是这个中国方面在印度洋的新的这个情势，他已经这个认为说印度洋对中国来讲是一个很重要的一个活动的区域。那么他最后讲到说，台湾跟印度也可能合作的一个领域，就说这个在台湾在南中国海、太平洋岛这个的确台湾在那边有最大的一个岛。那么希望透过台湾跟其他国家，美国、日本对于这个科技方面的合作 ，oceanography 这个海洋的这个研究，那么使得说这个台湾能够扮演更重要的这种角色。那么他也提到说，这个将来从南中国海这种合作还可以花进到印度洋。那么以后我们会再谈说将来台印之间还有什么样的一个领域我们可以来合作。那下面